There is a particular kind of violence that leaves no mark on the body. The Joint Treaty Commission of the Valeric Compact had practiced it for 3 centuries before humanity ever walked through its doors, and they were very good at it. They called it administrative resolution. They meant erasure. I was 26 years old when I took the posting as commission clerk 3rd grade, which meant I sat at the back of the chamber behind a low stone partition and transcribed every word spoken at the table into the compact's official record. The record was everything. In the compact's legal cosmology, if something was not in the record, it had not happened. If a species was not in the record, it did not exist, or had existed only as a footnote, a minor entry in the colonial ledger, a dependent polity that had been granted provisional standing, and could have that standing revoked at any session by simple majority without appeal. I had watched it done. I had written the words myself in the compact's formal script with the ink that did not smear. 17 entries in my first 4 years. 17 species reduced from provisional partners to historical curiosities. The commission was efficient. It was orderly. It believed in process the way a surgeon believes in the knife, not out of sentiment but because it worked. I want to be precise about what the commission was because it matters to what happened later. It was not a war council. It did not command fleets. It did not issue ultimatums backed by massed firepower. It was, in the strictest sense, a bureaucratic body, 8 senior commissioners representing the compact's 8 founding species, convened 3 times yearly in the Hall of Instruments on Veth Secundus to review treaties, arbitrate trade disputes, and maintain the official archive of recognized polities. Its weapon was not the warship. Its weapon was the pen, and the stamp, and the file. It had never needed anything else. Humanity's provisional standing in the compact had been granted 14 years before I arrived at my post, under conditions that the commission had structured with characteristic precision. The terms were humiliating in the way that only legal documents can be humiliating, every clause perfectly civil, every provision framed as a concession, every right contingent on behavior the commission had defined and reserved the authority to redefine. Earth contributed to the compact's common infrastructure fund at a rate 3 times that of any founding member. Earth's delegates could speak at sessions but could not vote. Earth's trade routes were subject to commission review without advance notice. Earth's archive entry described humanity as a developing species of limited interstellar reach, currently under compact guidance and subject to provisional renewal each 7th year. The renewal was coming up when I arrived. I remember Commissioner Halt, senior commissioner for the Aresi delegation, a broad-shouldered being whose ceremonial robe was so heavy with precedent metals that it took an aide to straighten it each morning, explaining the situation to me during my first week. "The humans have been troublesome," Halt said, "not angry, not even especially interested, the way you describe a drainage issue. They've been pressing for modification of their entry terms, the rate adjustment request, the voting access petition, the route review clause." "And the Commission's view?" I asked. "We have a view," Halt said, and returned to his papers. The review session came 6 weeks later. I sat behind my partition with my transcription slate and watched the 8 commissioners take their places in the half-circle of carved Veth marble that had seated compact deliberations for longer than most of the compact's member species had held interstellar travel. The hall was cool and dim except for the table lights, which cast a bluish-gray pallance across the proceedings. The smell of the place, old stone, cooling systems, archival seal wax, I associate still, even now, with the particular texture of organized power exercising itself without embarrassment. Earth's delegation that day was led by a man named Torsten Reed. He was perhaps 50, compact in build, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had been arranged by decades of diplomatic work into a condition of settled neutrality. Not the neutrality of someone who did not care, but the neutrality of someone who had learned that showing what you cared about was a disadvantage in rooms like this one. He sat across the table from the commissioners with two aides flanking him, and a stack of documents before him that he had clearly prepared in exhaustive detail. He never got to present them. The commission had its own procedures. Commissioner Halt opened the session, noted that the seventh-year renewal of Earth's provisional standing was on the agenda, acknowledged the Earth delegation's presence, and then, before Reed could draw breath, called for a motion. Commissioner Thesset of the Paolny Concord made the motion. It was long. It was formal. It invoked 14 separate precedents from the Commission's archive. The substance of it, translated out of its procedural armature, was this: Earth had demonstrated insufficient compliance with compact developmental benchmarks. Earth's request for modified terms constituted evidence of an unwillingness to accept compact guidance. The appropriate response, under precedent Arkell-Morvain, the one they always used for this, the one that had ended 17 other provisional standings, was not renewal but reclassification. Reclassification meant removal from provisional standing. It meant Earth's archive entry would be updated to reflect terminated provisional status. It meant the trade and contact sanctions that attached automatically to that status. No compact vessel calling at Earth ports, no Earth vessel permitted at compact stations, no commercial data exchange, no diplomatic communication through compact channels. It meant that Earth would, in the compact's official reality, cease to be a political actor and become a historical notation. It was not war. It was something the Commission considered cleaner than war. I watched Reed during Thesset's reading of the motion. He did not interrupt. He did not lean forward. His aides exchanged a look, a brief, almost involuntary tightening around the eyes, but Reed himself remained still, his hands flat on the table in front of his untouched documents, his expression doing nothing at all. When Thesset finished, Halt asked if the delegation wished to address the motion before the vote. Reed looked at Halt for a moment. Then he looked at each commissioner in turn, slowly, without particular urgency, the way you check a room before you left it. Then he sat back in his chair. He said nothing. Halt called the vote. 8 commissioners, 8 affirmations. I wrote it down. The motion carried. Earth's provisional standing was terminated. Its archive entry was to be updated by end of session, and the standard sanction package took effect at the close of business. Reed gathered his documents into a neat stack. He signaled his aides. He stood, pushed his chair in precisely so that it sat flush with the table, and walked out of the hall without a word, without a backward look, at a pace that was not hurrying and was not dawdling. He simply left, the way you leave a room where the meeting is over. The hall doors closed behind him. I finished transcribing the vote. I stamped the session record. I updated Earth's archive entry with the language the Commission's legal staff had prepared in advance, because they always prepared it in advance. Under the line that had read developing species, provisional standing, 7th-year renewal, I wrote, in the compact's formal script, provisional standing terminated, Arkell-Morvain reclassification, full sanction schedule in effect. Historical notation pending final archive review. Then I closed the file. I was 26 years old. I thought that was the end of it. I stayed at the Commission for 11 more years. I was promoted twice, to 2nd grade at 31, to 1st grade at 35, which meant I sat closer to the table and my transcription mattered more, but the work was fundamentally the same. I recorded what was said. I maintained what had been said. I was, in the Commission's structure, the memory of the room. In my first years after the vote, Earth came up occasionally as a minor administrative item. The sanction enforcement reports, the border delineation orders that accompanied reclassification, the standard boilerplate, no exceptions, no exemptions, no compact registered vessel to call at Sol system ports. The Commission processed these items in 15 minutes or less and moved on. Those were, in most respects, quiet years for the Commission. The compact's normal business continued, treaties negotiated, disputes arbitrated, provisional standings reviewed and mostly renewed, the occasional reclassification when a species failed to meet its developmental benchmarks. I got better at my work. I learned the Commission's rhythms, which session cycles carried the heaviest loads, which commissioners drafted their own motions, and which ones relied on their legal staff, which procedural fights were substantive, and which were positional maneuvering by delegations that wanted to be seen as rigorous without actually caring how the vote went. I learned to read the room the way a clerk reads a room, not for drama, but for the register of power, who was listening and who was waiting to speak, who was confident and who was performing confidence, which silences were deliberate and which were the silences of people who did not know what to say. Commissioner Halt was a man who knew what to say. He had been in the Commission's senior chair for 19 years when I arrived, and he ran sessions with the particular authority of someone who had sat in the room long enough that the room's habits had become his habits, or perhaps vice versa. He was not unkind. He was simply fully convinced that the world he occupied was the correct world, that the Commission's categories were the correct categories, and that events which did not fit those categories were anomalies to be processed rather than signals to be interpreted. He processed Earth's reclassification as such an anomaly, troublesome species, insufficient compliance, correct outcome under precedent. The matter was closed. The file was stamped. The Commission moved on. I remember one incident, small in itself, from my second year after the vote. I was in the record room cataloging a backlog of session exhibits, the physical documents that parties brought to Commission sessions as evidence, which were officially logged and filed, but which no one ever looked at again once they were in the archive. Among them was the stack of documents Torsten Reed had brought to the reclassification session, the documents he had never gotten to present. I was not supposed to open them. They were sealed exhibits from a closed matter, and exhibits from closed matters were archived intact. My function was to confirm the seal, record the exhibit number, and file them. I confirmed the seal. I recorded the exhibit number. I held the stack in my hands for a moment. It was perhaps 30 pages, bound with a plain cord, nothing written on the outside, and I thought about a man who had spent time preparing this argument and had never been given the 30 seconds he would have needed to open his mouth and begin it. Then I filed the stack in the appropriate drawer and closed the archive and went back to work. I do not know if I would have found in those pages any early indication of what Reed intended to do. I suspect not. I think he was too careful a person to bring his actual plans to a Commission session. I think what was in that stack was exactly what it appeared to be: a competent legal and commercial argument for modified terms, prepared by someone who understood the Commission's processes and expected to be allowed to use them. The decision to do otherwise, to go around the Commission rather than through it, to build rather than petition, I think that came later. I think it came in the moment of the vote, or perhaps in the moment of walking through the hall's doors, or perhaps during the long transit back to Saul's system. I do not know when exactly. I know that whatever happened in that mind in those hours or days produced 11 years of patient, systematic construction. It was in my 4th year after the vote. I was 30, newly promoted, sitting 2 positions closer to the table, that I first heard the name spoken with something other than procedural indifference. It was Commissioner Thesset's aide, a young Palney named Vel, speaking to one of the Arresi support staff in the corridor outside the record room during a recess. They did not see me. I was replacing a transcription cell and had my back to them. "The routing data doesn't make sense," Vel said. His voice was low, not secretive exactly, but careful. 7 compact carriers in the Tessarine corridor, and none of them logging Sol system contact, but the throughput numbers don't add up to anything that works without a hub somewhere in that volume. "Trade drift," the Arresi staffer said. "It happens after a major reclassification. Patterns take years to settle." "This isn't drift. Drift is random noise. This is a pattern. Vel paused. Someone is running logistics through a network that isn't ours. I finished replacing the cell and walked back to my station. I noted the conversation in my personal log, the habit of a clerk, not an investigator. I thought nothing significant of it for another 2 years. Then the Dreschen trade mission failed. The Dreschen were a compact provisional member, one of the newer ones, elevated to provisional standing only 8 years prior. They were in negotiations to establish a commercial corridor through the Tessarine volume, which would have been the most direct route between the compact's eastern and western clusters. The negotiations had been proceeding for 3 years. They collapsed in a single session when the Dreschen lead negotiator returned from a 6-week survey mission and announced that the corridor they had intended to develop was already fully developed. The infrastructure was there. The stations were there. The routing protocols were there. The compact's commercial survey maps had shown that volume as empty, contested transit space, uninhabited except for a handful of marginal outposts. The Dreschen weren't navigating uninhabited space. They were navigating someone else's corridor. Commissioner Halt called for a full survey report. It took 11 weeks to compile. When it arrived, Halt read it in a closed session, which was unusual. Most commission business was conducted in open session, because the commission's authority derived in part from its visibility. Closed sessions happened for 3 categories of item: internal personnel matters, active security concerns, and results that required deliberation before entry into the public record. I was not in the closed session. I was third clerk by that point. I had been assigned responsibility for the sealed record, which meant I filed and archived closed session transcripts, but did not produce them. The transcript came to me in a sealed envelope 3 days after the session, in the hand of Commissioner Halt's personal aide, who placed it on my desk without comment. I filed it, I did not read it. That was not my function. But I read the summary that Halt released to the full commission 6 weeks later, because that was in the open record, and I transcribed it. The summary was brief. The survey had confirmed the presence of a previously unmapped and apparently privately constructed network of transit hubs, relay stations, and commercial facilities throughout the Tessarine volume, and extending into 3 adjacent sectors. The network appeared to be in active use by a significant number of non-compact species. The architectural and engineering signatures of the infrastructure were consistent with, and here Halt paused for slightly longer than necessary before continuing, the developmental style associated with Earth's pre-sanctioned commercial construction. The Commission would be convening a special session to review the implications. I finished the transcription. I put my stylus down and looked at the words I had just written. I picked the stylus back up and added, in the margin of my personal copy only, never the official record, 2 words: they built. The special session met 8 weeks later. I was in my place behind the partition. The 8 commissioners sat in their usual half-circle. There were additional attendees: senior trade officials from 4 of the founding delegations, 2 officers from the Compact's Route Monitoring Authority, and a Compact intelligence liaison whose name was redacted from the official attendee list, but who I had seen in the building before and knew by sight. The route monitoring officers presented first. They had been thorough. The Tessarine network was not the only one. There were 3 confirmed networks of similar scale in other sectors previously classified as contested transit or low-activity fringe space. There were 2 more networks at an earlier stage of development, in sectors the Compact survey teams had not revisited in more than 20 years because there had been nothing there worth revisiting. Total infrastructure assessed, more than 400 discrete installations. Estimated operational capacity, sufficient to support the commercial throughput of a mid-tier Compact member in good standing. Commissioner Thesset asked the obvious question: how many vessels? The route monitoring officer paused. She was pale like Thesset, and she had the manner of a person delivering a report whose implications she would prefer not to be the one standing in front of. She said that active vessel counts were difficult to determine because the network used routing protocols that did not conform to any compact registry standard, but the density of transit signatures suggested several hundred vessels operating regularly, with evidence of much higher traffic during what appeared to be scheduled commercial cycles. Earth vessels, Thesset said. Earth flagged, yes. Also vessels of multiple other species. We have confirmed traffic from at least 14 species currently holding no formal standing with the compact. The silence in the hall lasted long enough that I counted it. 11 seconds. Halt said that will be sealed. I wrote it down. Then I walked the transcript to the sealed archive and locked it. It was the 4th year after the vote. I was 30. I sat in my chair in the record room that evening after the session ended and the hall had emptied, and I thought about Torsten Reed pushing his chair in precisely so that it sat flush with the table. The gesture of a man who was done with a room and intended to leave it properly. Not the gesture of a man who was broken by it. The commission convened 7 special sessions over the following 3 years. I was present for all of them. The pattern in the information was consistent and its direction was consistent. The network was expanding. The number of non-compact species using it was growing. The routing protocols it used were being adopted as a de facto standard by species that had never had occasion to interact with the compact at all. Species in the outer sectors, the fringe reaches, places the compact's commercial gravity had never fully extended to. In the 5th special session, I was 32, first grade now, sitting 2 seats from the table's end. The intelligence liaison presented a document that had taken his office 14 months to prepare. It was a map, not the kind the commission usually reviewed, not a transit chart or a commercial corridor diagram. It was a political map. It showed the known polities of inhabited space and their formal relationships. The compact was rendered in the compact's traditional deep blue. Its member species, its provisional members, its historical notations. And then there was a second color on the map. Gold, in the Commission's color convention, indicated recognized trading partners without formal membership. The Commission had not assigned gold to anyone in this rendering. The intelligence liaison had used it for something else. He used it to show every polity that had established a formal commercial relationship with the network headquartered in Sol System. The gold was everywhere. Not dominant. The compact's blue still covered more of the map, but the gold was not on the margins. It was woven through the middle of the map, through sectors the compact depended on, along routes the compact used, around and between, and through the blue in a way that was not the pattern of a fringe actor or a regional curiosity. It was the pattern of a center. Commissioner Alden of the Maverick delegation, quiet man, said perhaps 40 words per session on average, the kind of official who was often underestimated by people who confused restraint with weakness, leaned forward and studied the map for a long time. Then he said, "When did Earth join the Drishy Accord?" The intelligence liaison said that Earth had been a founding signatory, 18 months ago. Commissioner Alden said, "The Drishy Accord is the largest free transit agreement in the outer sectors." The liaison said that was correct. Alden said, "We have been trying to negotiate accession to the Drishy Accord for 6 years." The liaison said that was also correct. Alden said nothing further. He sat back in his chair. I wrote all of it down. Between sessions, I had begun doing something I had not done before in my career. I had begun reading the sealed archive. Not the current sealed files, I would not touch those, but the historical ones, the records more than 50 years old that had passed out of active classification and were technically open to commission staff. I read them at night in the record room after the building had emptied. I told myself I was conducting background research for context. That was partially true. The other part was that I was trying to understand something that my training had not prepared me to understand, what it meant to be written out of a record. The Commission's record room at night was a particular kind of quiet. Not peaceful, it was the quiet of a large institution at rest, full of the ambient mechanical sounds of cooling systems and archival humidity controls, the occasional vibration of a transit vehicle passing on the level below. I sat at my desk with the historical files and a single lamp, and I read the Commission's record of its own behavior across 3 centuries, and I tried to understand what I was part of. The Commission had been founded on a genuine principle. I want to be fair about this, because it matters for understanding what came later. The founding compact was an attempt to create a stable, rules-based framework for the political relationships of inhabited space, a substitute for the wars that had preceded it, the decades of unregulated conflict between expanding species that had left wide belts of contested space and several near-extinction events on the historical ledger. The Commission's founders were not cynical. They believed that a common record, maintained by a neutral body with broad authority, was better than no common record, that even an imperfect account of political reality was better than the chaos of competing, irreconcilable accounts. They were right about that as far as it went. The problem was what happened to the principle over 3 centuries of institutional practice. Principles maintained by institutions have a tendency to bend in the direction of the institution's interests, slowly, in ways that are invisible from the inside because each individual adjustment seems reasonable at the time. The Commission had not set out to make its record a tool of power rather than a tool of truth. It had simply made, over 3 centuries, 1,100 decisions in which those 2 purposes were in tension, and it had chosen, more often than not, the one that preserved its authority. By the time Thorsten Reed sat across the table from 8 commissioners, the record was not principally a tool of truth. It was principally a tool of the Commission, which meant a tool of the 8 founding species, which meant a tool of the interests those 8 species shared, the stable continuation of the order in which they sat at the center. I am not saying the Commission was corrupt. Corruption is too simple. The Commission believed in what it was doing. That was the harder thing to sit with. The other part was that I was trying to understand something that my training had not prepared me to understand, what it meant to be written out of a record. The Compact's archive was very old. It went back 3 centuries, to the founding compact itself, the document that had established the Commission and its authority, and the principle that the compact's record was the authoritative account of political reality in inhabited space. In 3 centuries, 46 species had been reclassified from provisional standing to historical notation. I read their files. I read the Commission session records from their final votes. The language was always the same motion structure, the same precedents, the same formal architecture of termination. And the outcomes were the same. 38 of the 46 had declined within a generation. 5 had stabilized but remained marginal. 2 had recovered partially, petitioned for reinstatement, and been readmitted at terms worse than their original provisional standing. 1, a species called the Varani, reclassified 90 years ago, I could find no subsequent record of at all. Historical notation, and then nothing. The compact's record had been correct for 45 of those 46 cases. Reclassification meant what the Commission intended it to mean. Erasure from the record produced, over time, erasure from the reality the record described. Earth was the 47th. I closed the archive files one night in my 34th year and sat in the dark record room and thought for a while. Then I wrote in my personal log, "The record is an instrument of power when the people outside the record accept that it describes them. It stops being an instrument when they don't." I did not add anything to that. It seemed sufficient. The Commission did not formally acknowledge the situation for 2 more years. They discussed it in closed session, and I filed those transcripts, and they discussed it in the corridors between sessions, and I heard pieces of those conversations, and they discussed it, I imagine, in private communications that I had no access to and no business having. What they discussed in open session, in the official record, was the general condition of compact trade relations, the route monitoring updates, the infrastructure assessment programs they had commissioned, and then quietly defunded when the assessments came back with information they did not want to put in the open record. They were very good at managing what the record said, 3 centuries of practice. I watched the management closely during those 2 years because it was the most instructive thing I had ever seen the Commission do, more instructive than any of its formal deliberations. What the Commission was doing was buying time to determine what to do. They could not make the situation go away. The surveys kept coming back. The routing data kept accumulating. The Dreschen mission failure was not an isolated case. 2 other compact provisional members had subsequently attempted commercial development in sectors that turned out to already be occupied, in the practical sense, by Earth's network. These incidents were logged as commercial survey anomalies and placed in a review queue that, as far as I could tell, had no intention of ever completing its review. The Commission could not unknow what it knew. But it was deeply reluctant to put what it knew into the open record, because the open record was the Commission's primary instrument of authority, and what the Commission now knew was that its authority was operating on a premise Earth as historical notation, the Tessarine volume as contested fringe space, 37 reclassified species as genuinely defunct. That was not true. Putting that into the record would require the Commission to act on it. And acting on it meant choosing between 2 options that were, from the Commission's perspective, both very bad. Option 1, proceed as though nothing had changed. Continue to maintain the record as it was. Continue to treat Earth as a historical notation and the sanctions as operative. This option had the advantage of preserving the Commission's formal position. It had the disadvantage of making the Commission's formal position increasingly disconnected from political reality, which was a problem for an institution whose authority derived entirely from its claim to describe political reality accurately. Option 2, acknowledge the situation and open negotiations. This meant admitting that the reclassification had failed, not legally, but practically, which was worse in some ways, because it was harder to resolve through procedure. It meant negotiating from a position that had weakened significantly over 11 years. It meant confronting the question of what terms Earth would now require, and the answer to that question was not going to be comfortable. The Commission chose, for 2 years, neither option. It chose the gap between them, the space of managed ambiguity, of information that was known but not recorded, of a reality that existed in the sealed transcripts but not in the official account of the world. I recorded what was in the open record, and I filed what was in the sealed record, and I kept my personal log, and I read the historical archive in the evenings, and I waited for the Commission to run out of room. It ran out of room in my 35th year, when a compact trade authority director submitted a formal report to all 8 commissioners noting that 3 major commercial negotiations had collapsed in the previous 18 months, because the counterparties had preferred to route through networks that the compact's official record did not acknowledge. The report did not use Earth's name. It did not need to. It was in the open record, and it was the first document in the open record that described the gap between the Commission's account of political reality and political reality itself. Halt convened the 7th special session, and this time he put the motion on the open record. The motion was procedural in framing, a Commission motion to initiate a review of Earth's reclassification under the provision that allowed the Commission to revisit historical notations when material circumstances had changed. The language was careful. It did not say what the material circumstances were. It did not need to. Everyone in the hall knew what the circumstances were. I had transcribed most of the evidence myself. The motion passed, 7-1. Commissioner Thesset voted against. He submitted a written dissent that I transcribed and filed, and the dissent was meticulous and principled and argued, correctly, that reopening a reclassification under political pressure rather than legal remedy set a dangerous precedent for Commission authority. He noted that the Commission's power derived from the consistency of its process, and that a review motivated by commercial inconvenience rather than legal error was a category error. A conflation of politics with law that would, if permitted to stand, hollow out the Commission's independence over time. He was right about all of it. He was also arguing against a tide that was already past the point where rightness was the relevant variable. The Commission's process had failed, not because it was inconsistently applied, but because it had been applied with perfect consistency to a situation that the process had not been designed to handle. Thesset saw the procedure clearly. He did not see what the procedure had missed. The Commission sent a formal communication through the Drishy Accord channel. Because the compact no longer had direct communication protocols with Sol's system, having terminated them at reclassification, and the Accord was the most efficient intermediary, requesting that Earth's government designate a representative for preliminary discussions regarding the reclassification review. The response came back in 11 days. I was not in the room when Halt read the response. I heard about it secondhand, from the intelligence liaison who was not laughing exactly. He was too careful a person to laugh, but whose voice carried something adjacent to laughter, a dry, tired quality, as he described it to one of the Maverick delegation's senior aides in the corridor outside the record room. Earth's government had designated a representative. The representative would attend a preliminary session at the Hall of Instruments on Veth Secundus, as requested. The Earth government acknowledged receipt of the Commission's communication and wished to note, for the record, that Earth had never recognized the validity of the reclassification and had, in the interim period, taken appropriate measures consistent with that position. The liaison said, "Appropriate measures, that's what it says, appropriate measures." The aide said, "What does that mean?" The liaison said, "I think it means they've been busy." The preliminary session was not preliminary in any meaningful sense. It was the full Commission in full session, and the 8 commissioners were in their places in the half-circle of carved Veth marble, and I was in my place behind the partition with my transcription slate, and there were more additional attendees than I had ever seen in the hall, senior officials from all 8 founding delegations, the heads of 3 compact trade authorities, the route monitoring director, the archive director, and a row of people I did not recognize who had arrived with the intelligence liaison and sat together along the chamber's south wall without being introduced. Earth's representative arrived precisely on time. She was perhaps 60, with dark brown skin and white hair cut close, dressed in a jacket that was neither ceremonial nor casual, something in between, something that was clearly formal without adopting the compact's conventions for formality, which was itself a statement, though a quiet one. She had 2 aides. She sat across the table from the commissioners, placed a document folder in front of her, not a stack this time, one folder thin, almost ceremonially sparse, and folded her hands over it. Commissioner Halt welcomed her. He used the standard language for preliminary sessions, with parties seeking reconsideration of standing. The language that assumed the petitioning party was in the supplicant position, because in 3 centuries that had always been the correct assumption. He noted that the Commission had initiated a review of Earth's historical notation, and was prepared to hear preliminary statements before determining the framework for further discussions. Earth's representative looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at each commissioner in turn, the same slow survey I remembered from Torsten Reed 11 years ago, without hurry, without aggression, without anything you could point to specifically except a quality of absolute precision, as though she were cataloging what she saw for purposes of her own. Then she was still. She did not offer a preliminary statement. She did not present a petition. She did not invoke the procedural mechanisms the Commission had built for this kind of session, the ones that required the petitioning party to formally request reconsideration and submit to the Commission's framework for review. She sat in her chair with her hands folded on her document folder, and she waited. Commissioner Halt said the Commission would hear from the Earth delegation at this time. She said nothing. Halt looked at his colleagues. The commissioners looked at each other with the controlled discomfort of people who were very experienced at maintaining composed expressions and were finding the experience more effortful than usual. Thesset said, "Delegate, the Commission has extended a significant procedural accommodation in agreeing to review the reclassification. The Earth government was informed of the session format." She looked at Thesset. She said nothing. Commissioner Alden, the quiet one, the one who had noted the Drishy Accord, the one who was often underestimated, leaned back in his chair and regarded her with an expression I had not seen on a commissioner's face before. Not discomfort, something more like recognition. He said, "What are your terms?" The other commissioners turned to look at him. A few of them looked as though they wanted to object to the question. None of them did. Earth's representative opened her document folder. She removed a single sheet, not a stack, one sheet, and placed it on the table in front of her. She did not slide it across. She placed it where she could see it in front of her own position, and then she pushed it once with 2 fingers to the center of the table. Then she folded her hands again. She said, "Full membership, equal terms with founding members, retroactive acknowledgement that the reclassification was without legal validity, archive entry amended accordingly." She paused. "And the infrastructure in Tessarine and the adjacent sectors remains ours. We do not negotiate that." The silence lasted longer this time. I counted 17 seconds. Commissioner Thesset said, "The Commission does not accept demands." She looked at him. She said nothing. He said, "What you are describing is not a petition for reconsideration. It is an ultimatum." She said, "I described our terms. Those terms are not acceptable." She nodded once, the minimal nod of a person who has registered information they expected. She gathered her folder. She signaled her aides. She stood, pushed her chair in so that it sat flush with the table, and walked toward the hall doors. I remember the sound of her footsteps on the marble floor, even, unhurried, carrying no particular weight of performance. She was simply walking toward the door. She was 3 steps from it when Commissioner Alden said, "Delegate." She stopped. She turned around, but she did not come back to the table. Alden said, "The Commission will need time to deliberate." She said, "Of course." She turned back to the door and went through it. The doors closed. The hall was quiet. I looked at the sheet of paper she had left in the center of the table. No commissioner had touched it. None of them reached for it now. After a moment, Halt said, "We'll recess." He said it in the voice of a man who needed a recess very badly. I walked around the partition to retrieve the document for the record. That was my function. Exhibits presented in session went into the file, and I read it as I lifted it from the table. It was not what I expected. I had expected terms. The terms she had described: membership, equal standing, retroactive acknowledgement, infrastructure. What I had expected was the legal language, the provisions, the schedules and procedures, the framework of a negotiation. What was on the sheet was a list. 43 names, each with a polity designation beside it. I recognized the Drishy Accord, and I recognized 4 other organizations from the intelligence reports I had filed. The others I did not know. They were all in the outer sectors, the fringe reaches, the places the compact's commercial gravity had never fully extended to. 43 polities, 43 formal relationships, 43 bodies that had, in the 11 years since Torsten Reed had pushed his chair in and walked out of this hall, established agreements with the entity the compact's record described as a historical notation. It was not a petition. She had told Thesset the truth about that. It was not an ultimatum either exactly. It was the record, Earth's record. The one they had written, while the Commission was busy writing Earth out of ours. I stood there in the empty hall for a moment with the sheet in my hand. Then I filed it correctly, stamped the exhibit, and returned to my partition. The Commission deliberated for 6 weeks. I am not going to describe those deliberations in detail because most of them were sealed, and even now, years later, I consider the sealed record to be the sealed record. What I will say is that in the 6 weeks of deliberation, the Route Monitoring Authority produced 3 additional surveys that Commissioner Halt had ordered. I filed the summary reports. The surveys extended the assessment of Earth's network into sectors the earlier surveys had not reached, and what they found was consistent with what the map had shown in the 5th special session. The network was not a regional phenomenon. It was interstellar in scope, and it was continuing to expand, and it was doing so without the compact's involvement, without the compact's protocols, without the compact's permission, and without any apparent concern for whether the compact's record acknowledged its existence. The 43rd name on that list was the Carathan Reach, a loose confederation of species in the far outer sectors that the compact's archive described as precontact civilizations with limited interstellar capability. The Carathan Reach had, according to the survey data, 3 commercial hubs running on Earth's routing protocols, with traffic volumes that put it solidly in the mid-development range. Precontact, that was what the Commission's archive said. I filed the survey. I went home. I sat on the roof of my housing block and looked at Veth Secundus's sky, which was a pale amber that time of year, and thought about a word, precontact, meaning the compact had not yet made contact, not meaning that no one had. When the Commission reconvened, the session was open. Halt had made the decision to conduct the final deliberation on the record, which I think was the right decision, and I think he knew it was the right decision even before he made it. The Commission had spent 3 centuries building an institution whose authority rested on the proposition that the record was the truth. Deciding Earth's fate in a closed session would have been, in some way that the Commission still understood instinctively, a betrayal of the thing that made the Commission what it was. So they did it in the open. I sat behind my partition with my transcription slate, and I wrote every word. Commissioner Thesset spoke first, and he argued well. He was consistent with his earlier dissent. The precedent risk was real. The integrity of the reclassification process was real. The danger of allowing economic pressure to override legal standards was real. He was, as he had always been, a principled institutionalist. He believed in the Commission, because the Commission's principled application of consistent rules was the thing that made it worth believing in. I agreed with almost everything he said about institutional integrity. I simply thought he was applying it to a situation the institution had not been designed for, and that the institution's designers, 3 centuries ago, had not imagined. They had not imagined a species that, when written out of the record, wrote its own. Commissioner Alden spoke last, before Halt called the motion. He said very little. He said that the Commission's function was to maintain the record of political reality in inhabited space, and that when the record diverged significantly from political reality, the Commission's function required it to update the record. He said that the record had diverged significantly from political reality. He said he would support the motion. Halt called the motion. It was the same kind of motion I had transcribed dozens of times, formal, procedural, armored in precedent. But this time the precedent was not Arkellen Morving. This time the precedent was the Commission's own founding compact, the passage that described the record not as an instrument of policy but as an instrument of truth, and required the Commission to maintain that alignment. 7 commissioners voted to offer Earth full membership on the proposed terms. Commissioner Thesset voted against. He submitted another written dissent. I transcribed the vote. I reached for the archive file that contained Earth's entry, the one I had last amended 11 years ago, adding the line about historical notation and sanction schedule, and I opened it to the relevant section. I had written the words provisional standing terminated into this file with my own hand. I had done my job. The record had been clear. I struck those words. I wrote new ones. The language the Commission's legal staff had prepared this time was different from the language they had prepared last time, less certain of itself, more careful at the edges, the language of people who have been humbled by events and are trying to be precise about that humility. I wrote it as it was given to me, in the compact's formal script, with the ink that did not smear. Full membership granted, founding compact terms as amended, reclassification of record Arkell and Morvain, applied session 14.7 of year 340, hereby acknowledged as administratively invalid and expunged. Archive entry amended effective this session. I stamped it, I closed the file. The Commission's aide went to the door of the hall and opened it. Earth's representative came back in. She had been waiting in the anteroom, because the deliberation had concluded faster than expected, and no one had thought to send word, and she returned to her seat across the table and sat down. Halt told her that the Commission had voted to grant full membership on the stated terms, with the retroactive amendment to the archive as requested, and that the Commission would prepare the formal accession document for signature at a subsequent session. She nodded. Halt said, "The Commission wishes to note, for the record, the extraordinary nature of the period of separation, and to express." "Commissioner," she said. He stopped. She looked at him, not unkindly, not with triumph or contempt or the particular satisfaction of a person watching a long-delayed wheel turn. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that they have said enough. "The record is enough," she said. Holt stopped. He nodded. He made a small gesture to his aide to close the formal remarks. She reached into her folder and removed another sheet. This one she slid across the table to Holt directly. He took it. He read it. He passed it without comment to the Commissioner on his left, who read it and passed it on, around the half-circle of carved Veth marble, until all 8 commissioners had seen it. I could not see it from my position. I waited. When the session formally closed and the commissioners had gathered their materials and filed out, I went to collect the exhibit for the record. That was my function. I lifted the sheet from the table. It was a document, a formal one, compact legal format, which surprised me because the Earth delegation's materials so far had notably avoided compact conventions. This was in the compact's format, in the compact's formal script, correctly structured. It was a list of 38 names, 38 species. I recognized the first 17 immediately because I had written their reclassification myself. The remaining 21 I recognized from the historical archive, the sealed records I had read in the evenings in the record room over the previous years. 46 reclassifications in 3 centuries, the Varani, whom I could find no subsequent trace of, and 37 others. Each name on Earth's list had a notation beside it: current standing, current location, current commercial relationships, not historical notations, present tense entries. 37 of the 46 species the Commission had reclassified as historical notations were listed here as active parties, with current standing in the network that now ran through the Tessarine volume and into the outer sectors. The 38th was the Varani. Their notation read, confirmed surviving community, outer sector designation TK7, current population approximately 40,000, commercial affiliation established 11 years ago. I stood in the empty hall for the second time in 6 weeks, holding a document, reading it. 40,000 Varani. 90 years after the Commission had written them into historical notation, and waited for the notation to become accurate. 40,000 people, the record said, no longer existed. Living in a sector the Commission's surveys had not revisited in 20 years because there was nothing worth revisiting there. I filed the document. I stamped it correctly. I returned to my partition and sat down. I had been a commission clerk for 15 years. I had written the words that the commission used to describe the world. I had been very careful and very precise, and I had believed, in the way that people believe in the instruments they maintain, that the words I wrote were the truth because the process that produced them was designed to produce the truth. I was 36 years old, and I was sitting in a chamber that still smelled of old stone and cooling systems and archival seal wax. And I was thinking about a woman who had come to a commission session 11 years ago with a stack of documents she never got to present, and had pushed his chair in precisely, so it sat flush with the table, and walked out of a hall he was never coming back to as a petitioner. Torsten Reed. I had not thought about him in years, not specifically, but I thought about him now. What it felt like to be in that room, to have the motion read, to know the vote before it happened, to hear 8 voices say yes to the thing being done to you, to gather your papers and stand up and make sure the chair was straight and walk out without a backward look. Not because you weren't angry, not because you weren't calculating everything already as you walked, but because giving the room the satisfaction of your expression was a thing you would not do. He had walked out of that hall and built 43 treaties and 400 transit installations, and a network that 43 species called their preferred routing, and that 37 other species the Commission had erased before Earth was ever at the table, had found their way into. He had done it without being in the record, without the Commission's protocols, without the Commission's permission, without, as far as I could tell from anything I had read in 15 years of filing Commission documents, a single moment of public complaint. I don't know where Reed was when Earth's representative came back to the hall that day. I don't know if he was alive. He would have been 61 if the years were right. I hope he was. I hope someone told him. I submitted my resignation to Commissioner Halt 3 months after the session. I gave him the professional reasons, which were real. I had been offered a position with the new Joint Archive Review Board that would be established under the accession agreement, the body charged with reviewing the historical record for entries that required amendment in light of the changed understanding of reclassification validity. It was a significant posting. Halt understood that. I did not give him the other reason, which was also real. I could not continue to sit behind a partition and write the compact's record after what I had spent 11 years watching the record fail to contain. The record was a tool, and like any tool it was only as good as the hand that used it and the purpose the hand served. I had learned that later than I should have. The Joint Archive Review Board took 7 years to do its work. I was one of 4 clerks assigned to it, the most junior, which suited me. We reviewed all 46 reclassification files. We reviewed the session records. We reviewed the sealed transcripts that the Commission authorized us to access, and there were more of those than any of us had expected, and some of them made for very hard reading. The findings are part of the public record now. I will not summarize them here. They speak clearly enough on their own. What I will say is this. On the last day of the review, when we had stamped the final amended entry and the board's senior archivist had closed the master file, I walked to the record room in the old part of the Hall of Instruments, the part that had not been renovated, that still had the original stone floors and the smell of seal wax, and I stood in the doorway for a while. I thought about what a record is, not what this commission had wanted it to be, which was a wall, a thing you built around a definition of the world to keep other definitions out, but what it actually was, at its best, in the hands of someone who understood why it existed. A record is a responsibility. It says, this happened, and it matters that it happened, and we will not pretend otherwise. It is a promise made to the future that the past will not be falsified for the convenience of the present. The commission had broken that promise 46 times, and one of those times the party they broke it toward had simply gone and built something that did not require their record to exist, and had been good enough at it, thorough enough, patient enough, that 11 years later the thing they built was more real than what the commission had tried to put in its place. I am not a person who speaks easily about what humans are capable of. I was a clerk for 20 years. I dealt in specifics, the word, the date, the stamp, the file. I am wary of large claims. But I stood in that doorway and thought about 40,000 Varani in outer sector TK7, and about the routing protocols running through the Tessarine volume, and about a man who had gathered his papers off a table and straightened a chair and walked out of a hall without a backward look. And I thought, they built it because they could not afford to wait. They built it because they knew, the moment the vote was read, that waiting was not the option they had been left with. They built it the way you build anything in those conditions, not because you are certain it will work, but because the alternative is becoming the thing the record says you are. The alternative was becoming a historical notation. They were not willing to be that. I turned off the light in the record room and closed the door behind me, and walked out through the hall of instruments into the amber Veth Secundus afternoon, and I did not look back either. The record had been amended, the truth had been put back in. That was enough, that was what the work was for.